thank you, and I do want to first start out apologizing I have to leave at 4:30 to catch a flight home, and I won't be able to stay with this full panel, but I very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and to be on this distinguished panel. I do want to say a special thanks to Ben and to the Liberty Tree Foundation and all the co-sponsors and others who worked on this important conference. I know it takes a lot to pull these kinds of things together, and I think it's a critically important day that we've had. So thank you very much, Ben and everyone. I'm going to just start by telling you how I got into suing the President and President Bush and Secretary Rumsfeld on the eve of the Iraq War. Senator Robert Byrd, as you may remember, had been a vocal opponent to the October 2002 resolution with regards to Iraq. He had gotten onto the floor of the U.S. Senate repeatedly during that very rushed debate to say that this was an unconstitutional delegation of the exclusive war powers that Congress holds under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution, an unconstitutional delegation of that war power to the President of the United States. And given his vocal opposition, once the resolution passed, I thought, well, why don't we go to court, Byrd v. Bush? I thought, well, why not take this where it needs to go, into the third branch of government? If Congress is not going to do its duty to comply with the Constitution and decide whether or not we go to war, if the President is going to seize monarchical powers and take us into an unconstitutional war, then there remained one other branch of government that needed to stand in the way and interpret and uphold the Constitution dating back to Marbury v. Madison, declaring what the law is, and that's the federal judiciary. And so in my other world, I do voting rights, election integrity work, and because of that, I have come to know somebody named Ken Heckler, who had been for many years the Secretary of State of West Virginia, and I decided to reach out to him and present this idea. And I remembered it was President's Day weekend, or perhaps it was Columbus Day weekend, I can't quite remember now, but anyway, I reached him soon after the resolution was passed in October 2002, and I explained this idea of why I thought Senator Byrd should step forward and sue the President, and that beyond Senator Byrd doing it, since members of Congress have had challenges around their standing, that we would gather members of the armed forces to join, we would gather parents of soldiers and so forth. And so Ken Heckler, Secretary Heckler, thought it was a good idea. He reached out to Byrd and quickly called me back to tell me that Senator Byrd wanted me to call him that first business day, Tuesday, after that holiday weekend. And I remember speaking to Senator Byrd about this, and he was quite engaged, and he asked me about standing issues, he asked me about ripeness issues, he asked me about the political question concerns, and I said all of these matters need to be brought before the court. And then he said, well, let me give this some thought and get back to you. And then I got a phone call a couple days later by the Senate counsel's office. And they said, we understand you had a conversation with Senator Byrd about representing him, and we want to talk to you about that. I said, well, I had a conversation with a potential client, attorney-client privilege, and I certainly didn't have it with the United States Senate as a whole. So if you want me to... Oh, no. We provide advice to individual senators about litigation they may engage in, and we will treat this confidentially. So then I went on to explain to her what the idea of the case was, and I could tell very quickly that was going to go nowhere, and I didn't hear back from Senator Byrd, and that was the end of it. And so I thought, wow, if Senator Byrd, despite his vocal opposition on the floor of the Senate, is not willing to take this into court, who really would? But then something happened a little while later, on New Year's Eve Day, 2002, that got me going again. Then President Bush would have these random press conferences while he's weeding in Crawford. There he was doing some of that weeding, and reporters would have a brief few moments to ask him some questions. And one reporter said, Mr. President, it seems inevitable that we're headed to war against Iraq. And he snapped, he said, "That's not for you to decide, that's for me to decide." And I'm looking at the television and said, "No, that's not for either of you to decide. The Constitution makes clear that Congress and only Congress has the power to declare war, and you should be sued. You should be taken into court on this matter." So then I all of a sudden got going again. I said, well, you know, if Senator Byrd's not going to do it, let's start with members of the armed forces. Let's gather them together. And we got 3 soldiers, one of whom was a Marine based in the Gulf already, all of whom would remain anonymous. To this day they have, to protect their identity from any retaliation. But all of them faced the imminent harm and had the standing to bring this kind of case. And then I reached out to Military Families Speak Out, to Elaine's group. I happened to, at that time, live in Boston, Massachusetts, in a neighborhood, Jamaica Plain. And in that same neighborhood, our 2 people were the co-founders of Military Families Speak Out, Charlie Richardson and Nancy Lesson, who had a son who was also facing imminent harm. A stepson to Nancy, Charlie's son, facing imminent harm going into Iraq in the armed forces. And they were part of this broad network that's, of course, evolved ever since, Military Families Speak Out, that came forward, that brought parents of soldiers together. And then with the parents of soldiers and with the soldiers, we went to the House side to take David's point that the House is more connected, or at least responsible. And of course, Congressman Conyers stood up, Congressman Kucinich stood up, Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr., a dozen members of Congress said, yes, we will stand with these three soldiers, we will stand with these parents of soldiers, these military families, and we will sue the president. And that is how this case got initiated. But I do want to come back to something that's been said earlier by Jamie Raskin this morning regarding this question of how the War Powers Clause was placed in the Constitution in the first place, because it goes directly to this mythology that somehow this is shared power between Congress and the President, a mythology that continues in some of the case law that's been done on this question. And as we know, this War Powers Clause emerged from that experience when the kings and queens of Europe had sent their subjects off into battle, often on their own personal whim. And there was a determination by the framers of the Constitution that this country would be different, that we would have this power invested in the people through their representatives in the United States Congress. And Thomas Jefferson talked about this as the desire to create, quote, an effectual check to the dog of war. George Mason said that he was for, quote, clogging rather than facilitating war. James Wilson, speaking at Pennsylvania's ratifying convention, stated, "This system will not hurry us into war. It is calculated to guard against it. It will not be in the power of a single man or a single body of men to involve us in such distress, for the important power of declaring war is vested in the legislature at large." And Alexander Hamilton, who, as we know, was one of the staunchest supporters of executive power, would later write, "The President is to be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. This would amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces as First General and Admiral of the Confederacy, while that of the British King extends to the declaring of war and to the raising and regulating of fleets and armies, all of which by the Constitution under consideration would appertain to the legislature." Madison would write several years after the adoption of the Constitution, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department. Beside the objection to such a mixture of heterogeneous powers, the trust and the temptation would be too great for any one man." Now, I read all that language to highlight that we are dealing here with an exclusive power that Congress and only Congress has on behalf of the people of the United States. It has been stated even today at this conference that this somehow is a complicated system, that this is a shared power, that Article 2 somehow is involved. Article 2 deals with how we go to war, whether we go with troops, whether we go with planes, whether we go with bombs only, whatever it may be. But that is a very, very different question than Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, which says Congress shall have power to declare war. And that is very clear. It is the most simple language in the Constitution. The War Powers Act, which has also been brought up repeatedly today, and frankly in a lot of this case law, is a total confusion to this point. The War Powers Act is a statute. Statutes, by definition, are inferior to the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. The only thing the War Powers Act can do is further articulate what is required under the Constitution. It cannot trump the Constitution. It cannot replace the Constitution. It is solely able to extend, under federal law, the principles enunciated in the Constitution. So when we say we need to amend the War Powers Act, or we need to start following the War Powers Act, the fact is we need to follow the War Powers Clause of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, and whatever happens after is beside the point. If people have problems in the post-9/11 era with respect to the War Powers Clause, and certainly there was a debate even after 9/11 that we don't need the declaration of war power anymore. Well, you know what? Do the proper thing. Work to amend the Constitution to say it's outdated, it's outmoded. We need to have a ability for the president to sign this. But don't just simply toss it to the side when it's there embedded in the Constitution. So I know I'm running out of time, but I did want to set out that context for where we are today. Now, it is true that since the Korean War, we have had a series of cases in which the courts in this country, including the Supreme Court, have abdicated their responsibility. And Mort Halperin said earlier